I've always had this thing where I start a ton of projects at once.
Hmm.
Like, seriously, I've got about 87 things going on right now. And I always thought it was just me being me,
Mm.
kind of all over the place. But get this. Apparently, it could actually be my inner entrepreneur fueled by ADHD wild right.
It is pretty interesting to see all the research coming out about ADHD and entrepreneurship these days, like
Yeah.
that Time, etc. article you sent over. They actually highlighted research that suggests ADHD brains might be wired for the business world.
Okay, now you've got to tell me more about that.
Well, it's like this. ADHD brains aren't wired quite the same as neurotypical brains. It's not that something is missing, really. It's more about the levels of certain neurotransmitters being different.
So you're saying it's not that we're not trying, our brains just kind of operate on a different system.
Exactly. And that's something that Karen McGill, the entrepreneur from the It's ADHD Friendly podcast, talks about. She said for years she couldn't understand why she couldn't just sit and work like everyone else seemed to. But then she discovered she had ADHD and it was like things finally clicked. She realized her brain just thrives on a different kind of structure and stimulation.
Well, that's good to know because, honestly, sometimes I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. But this is where all this advice from entrepreneurs with ADHD comes in handy, right?
Mhm.
Because we're not just talking about productivity gurus with perfectly organized desks here. These are people who actually live with this stuff.
That's right. And they're proving that not only can you manage ADHD, you can actually make it into a superpower. McGill actually uses this term, genius zone, to describe those periods of hyperfocus that a lot of people with ADHD experience.
Okay, the genius zone. I like the sound of that. But how do we tap into that more often? Because let's be real, procrastination is a thing.
Oh, it's definitely a thing. And it's not like you can just flip a switch, unfortunately. But the It's ADHD Friendly episode did have some good advice on that McGill talked about planning her week strategically, like around her natural energy levels. If she knows she tends to slump in the afternoons, she'll schedule less demanding tasks for then and save her peak focus time for when she's feeling more alert and creative.
So it's all about figuring out your own rhythm and kind of like working with it instead of against it.
Exactly. And honestly, part of that is accepting that you might need a different kind of structure than that traditional 9 to 5 grind. It's about figuring out what works for you and not trying to force yourself into a mold that just doesn't fit.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm guessing that's where things like body doubling can come in.
Mm.
Because let's be honest, sometimes we need a little extra help to stay on track, right?
Oh, absolutely. Body doubling is basically just having someone there, either in person or virtually, to provide that sense of accountability and help you stay focused.
So it's kind of like having a workout buddy, but for your to-do list.
Yeah.
I can see how that would be helpful, especially for those moments when you're about to get sucked into the procrastination vortex.
Precisely. The Time, etc. article has a great anecdote about it. They interviewed this entrepreneur with ADHD who swears by virtual body doubling sessions. He said it's been a game changer for his productivity because it sort of taps into that social aspect of work that a lot of ADHD brains find really energizing.
It's like having a built-in cheerleader for those moments when you're about to get distracted by, like, a stray thought or, let's be honest, that tempting social media tab.
Exactly. And speaking of distractions, we should talk about how to minimize those as much as possible. That copywriter you mentioned from Between the Lines Copy, she had some really smart tips on this.
Oh, yeah, she was the one who was big on keeping things visually very minimal and always putting her phone on D&D while she works, right?
Yes. She was saying that our brains, especially those with ADHD, are just naturally wired to be constantly scanning for and responding to every little stimuli.
Mhm.
So if you're trying to focus in a workspace that's visually chaotic, it's like trying to focus in the middle of a hurricane.
Yeah.
Your brain never really gets a chance to truly settle and concentrate.
Yeah, it's like constant sensory overload, which can be completely exhausting. But I'm curious, what did she say about how to deal with, like, all the random thoughts and to-dos that pop into your head at the most inconvenient times?
She had a really great system for that. She called it her everything list.
Okay, everything list. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
So basically, anytime a thought, idea, to-do item, really just anything pops into her head, she writes it down on this master list. She says it's like giving her brain permission to kind of relax, knowing that it's all been captured and won't be forgotten.
So it's like decluttering your mind the same way you declutter your physical space. That's a really cool concept. I like that.
Mhm.
But I do want to go back to procrastination for a minute, because I feel like that's something that a lot of us with ADHD really struggle with.
Oh, absolutely. Procrastination. It's a universal struggle, but for people with ADHD, it can feel like this constant battle between what you know you should be doing and what your brain wants to be doing.
Tell me about it. It's like my brain is a master at finding the most random distractions at the absolute worst possible times.
And that actually goes back to the way our brains are wired. You know how that Time, etc. article talked about how ADHD brains tend to get this surge of dopamine from starting tasks?
Yeah.
It's not just about finishing them, it's the starting that really gets us going.
Oh, okay. So it's like each new task is like this shiny new object that kind of sets off those reward pathways.
Exactly, which explains why we end up with so many unfinished projects, right?
Right. So how do we break that cycle?
Huh. Well, the good news is once you kind of understand the why behind it, you can start to develop strategies that work with your brain instead of against it. And that Time, etc. article actually had this great technique called procrastination ping pong to help with this.
Procrastination, ping pong. Okay, now I have to know more.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So it's all about becoming really aware of that split-second moment when you're about to switch tasks. You know that feeling when you're working on something and suddenly you just have this urge to check your email or scroll through social media or even just get up and go get a snack.
Oh, yeah, I know that feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like my brain's way of hitting the escape button.
Yes, exactly. But with procrastination ping pong, the idea is that as soon as you feel that urge, you mentally ping yourself back to the original task. So it's like catching yourself in the act of procrastinating and then gently redirecting your focus back to what you're supposed to be doing.
So it's like a mindfulness exercise, but for your productivity.
Yeah.
I get behind that. But what about when you need something a little more structured, to really stay on track?
That's where things like the Pomodoro technique can be really helpful, especially for people who work best in those shorter bursts of focus.
Yes. And I love the twist on the Pomodoro technique that the Fast Company article mentioned. Co-working Pomodoro sessions. I've actually been experimenting with that lately. And it's amazing how much of a difference it makes to have that accountability, even if it's just virtual. Knowing that there are other people working alongside me, it really helps me stay motivated.
It's like that sense of camaraderie,
Okay.
like you're not alone in the trenches. And it plays into that social element that a lot of ADHD brains find really beneficial.
Totally. Plus those little breaks in between Pomodoros, those are key too. Sometimes a quick mental reset is all you need to come back feeling refreshed and focused. Speaking of refreshed, I did want to go back to something we talked about earlier, which is that idea of structuring your workday around your energy levels. I know we talked about it a bit with Karen McGill's approach, but it seems like it's something that comes up a lot with entrepreneurs who have ADHD.
It really does. And it makes sense when you think about it. The traditional 9 to 5 workday, it wasn't designed with ADHD in mind.
Right. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, It's just not a good fit.
That's a great way to put it. And I think these sources do a good job of emphasizing how important it is to find a rhythm that works with your ADHD instead of against it. Whether that means starting your workday later, taking more frequent breaks, or even incorporating more movement and activity into your routine, it's all about honoring your own natural energy flow.
Yeah, and that's something that Jenna Kutcher, the entrepreneur from the Gold Digger blog, talks about. I think she mentioned that she likes to move around her house while she's working, which for some people might be distracting, but for her, it's actually how she stays focused and engaged.
Exactly. It's all about giving yourself permission to work in a way that feels authentic to you, even if it means ditching that traditional desk setup.
So it's less about trying to fit into this one specific mold and more about creating an environment and a structure that actually supports your own unique needs and preferences.
Exactly. And that actually leads into another really important theme that comes up a lot in these sources, which is the idea of self-acceptance.
Let's talk about that because I think that's a huge one.
Right.
It's one thing to learn strategies and techniques for managing your ADHD, but it's another thing entirely to really embrace those unique traits as part of what makes you you. It's true, though, like there's so much pressure out there to conform, especially in the business world. But what I love about these entrepreneurs is that they're showing it's okay to be different.
Yeah.
To like embrace your own way of working and even to kind of view your ADHD as an asset.
Yeah, it's a real shift in perspective, isn't it? From seeing ADHD as this liability to seeing it as a strength. And honestly, it can be so empowering. The copywriter from Between the Lines Copy, she had this great line. She said, ADHD is manageable if you make a conscious effort to play into it and harness the superpower that it can be.
Love that. So it's about working with it, not against it,
No.
which makes sense when you think about all the incredible strengths that can come with ADHD, like
Yeah.
that ability to hyper-focus on tasks that really light you up,
Yeah.
or just the way your brain seems to naturally make all these connections and come up with new ideas. That's huge in the entrepreneurial world, right?
Absolutely. Those traits are pure gold when it comes to innovation and problem solving. It's like having a totally different lens on the world, a way of seeing possibilities that other people might miss.
Totally.
But it's not always easy to see it that way, is it? especially when you're stuck in those day-to-day struggles of just managing the ADHD.
And that's why self-acceptance is so important. It's about accepting that your journey might look different from someone else's. And that's okay. You might need to try different things, experiment with different strategies to find what works for you, and also just giving yourself permission to work in a way that feels authentic and sustainable to you.
It's like giving yourself grace, to celebrate the wins, no matter how big or small, and to not beat yourself up on the days when things don't go as planned. Because let's be real, we all have those days. We do. And I think it's important to remember that consistency with ADHD, it's going to look different for everyone. It's not about being perfect. It's about being persistent. It's about showing up for yourself even when it's hard. And honestly, finding a way to enjoy the process.
Absolutely. And what's been really eye-opening in hearing these entrepreneurs talk about their experiences is that ADHD really isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
That's so true.
It can look so different from person to person, and what works for one person might not work for another at all.
Ugh.
So it's really about finding your own way.
It really is. And that's why I think it's so important to approach all of this with a sense of curiosity, and self-compassion. Keep experimenting, keep learning about yourself, and keep kind of tweaking your strategies until you find that sweet spot where you're really able to leverage your strengths and create a business and a life that feels aligned with who you are.
So for anyone listening who's on that journey right now, just remember, you are not alone. And ADHD, yeah, it might bring some challenges,
Yeah.
but it also comes with its own unique set of superpowers. And the key is to embrace those superpowers and find ways to use them to create something amazing.
Imagine what's possible when you stop trying to fit into a mold that doesn't quite fit right, when you can just be yourself and build a business that celebrates all the incredible things that make you.
That is a powerful message. Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive. I feel like we both learned a lot today.
I agree. I love these deep dives because it's always a good reminder that there's always more to learn and more to explore.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little inspiring. And we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.